He is a broadcasting icon in motorsports. It is the great Ray Dunlap. You have seen him on FS1. You have seen him on ESPN with FS1 shows and the Truck Series, ARCA Racing Series. He was a pit reporter for ESPN going back to 1997, has worked in PR. He knows the sport very well. And now everybody is going to learn about his life and get to know him better. So he is on the On to Something podcast. I'm Bryan Fenley, a national anchor at Fox Sports Radio. Ray, it's fun. I'm excited to do this and talk about your career. Clearly, you are a Cincinnati Reds fan, not that you had any giveaways from behind you. I see Pete Rose sliding in, and then you got the jersey to the left of the screen. And I wanted to start here. You are infamous for the mustache. Why have you lost it?
You know, it was one thing happened. I was doing a Pee Wee Herman Halloween costume, and I shaved the mustache off. And my wife says, "You look like you're 10 years younger." And I said, "Boy, I'll take that any day."
So you've done that. And I want to go early on in your career.
Okay.
And Bobby Rahal and the impact that he had to get you onto the national scene as a network broadcaster. What role did he play to find you as a talent and then bring you aboard and introduce you to people who then would one day allow you to be a nationwide name?
Well, I don't know if he found me or if I found him, but we got together at a club in Columbus, Ohio. Of course, his race team was based there, and I started a public access channel show there, and it was really fun. My concept was to go to short tracks, to Columbus Motor Speedway, to go to Mid-Ohio, and do sort of a highlights package show, and get myself a little bit more on set time. And I ran into Ray Hall, and he says, "Hey, you're that guy that does that show that's on at 2 a.m. I said, "Yeah, that's me." And I said, "I'd love to do an interview with you." And he gave me his business card, says, "Call anytime, we'll set it up." And I went up and I did this interview with him. We did almost 3 hours. And he was like, "Man, I can't believe how much knowledge you have about my life and my career." I was a huge fan of his. In the Columbus racing scene, of course, he was the king, and so good at what he did. So when I put this interview together, I packaged it over like a 4 or 5 episode series, and a lot of people saw it. And some folks from ESPN happened to be in Columbus for an Ohio State football game, and they saw it and they said, "Wow, we think this kid has some potential." So it was really quite a little feather in my cap to have a superstar on a public access channel show in Columbus.
For 3 hours, you did this with him. What was 3 hours like of conversation with him, and how did you keep that conversation with Bobby engaging and informative? Which obviously, it's hard to find anybody that knows the sport better than you.
Yeah, well, I think part of it was the fact that I knew him and his career so well, but in a bigger picture, we started going down the road of not just motorsports, but about how television works in sports. And, he was kind of interested at that time of deciding what his next move would be in the big picture. His driving career was coming to an end. He had a good race team and they won a little bit, but they weren't championship form. And a lot of what we talked about was how you build an organization, which was very intriguing because he's an incredibly insightful person. Obviously, what he's done after his career is just about as important in motorsports as what he did as a driver. But the Truman family was instrumental in Columbus of keeping motorsports alive. They had the Red Roof Inn franchise and then Mid-Ohio Sports Car Course. And Jim Truman was an incredibly interesting person too. And Bobby gave me a lot of insight about him. And just really about the world of motorsports, and we started talking, and it just went on for a long time. But it made some really nice episodes because we cut back and forth from the different topics as I put those shows together.
Those shows you put together, eventually you would get onto ESPN, and I watched your first hit. I went back and I watched it, and I saw it in an interview was brought up where the opportunity arose for you on ESPN. You looked so calm. You looked obviously like you knew what you were doing. why do you feel like when so many, when they get that first shot of the national scene, it becomes very exhausting because you're emotionally spent, you're nervous.
Sure.
You seemed to be so comfortable in that moment.
I think part of it was my knowledge of the product at that time. I can remember doing a stand up with Ned Jarrett on the roof at Michigan, and Benny Parsons had gotten food poisoning when I got that opportunity. And we got done, and excuse me, Ned looked over at me and he said, where'd you get all that info? And I said, well, unfortunately, it's all in here. It was really a passion of mine, and especially at that time, I kept saying I got to be prepared. I got to be prepared in case one of these opportunities comes along. And I had the TV show in Columbus helped me with a lot of time. I was very fortunate, Brian, because we had the ASA series came to Columbus Motor Speedway, so we had big names like Bob Seneker and Mike Eddy, and drivers on a national scene, not just local guys. Then having dealt with Ray Hall, and I went to Toledo to do an ARCA race, and we had the big stars of ARCA there. And so I think it's just that number of repetitions that I had prior to getting my ESPN opportunities that really gave me the preparation.
Ray Dunlap is with us, motorsports broadcaster extraordinaire. I'm Bryan Fenley with Fox Sports Radio. So you go from ESPN and then Fox comes calling. How did that happen for you?
Well, it's very interesting. Actually, I had just signed a 3-year extension with ESPN. And late in the season of NASCAR in 2001, the TV contract came up. It used to be that each racetrack did their own TV rights deals, and they consolidated that with NASCAR in 2001. And when they went out and did the deals, everybody at ESPN was incredibly confident that we were going to keep that portion of our broadcast schedule, and it didn't happen. And NBC and Fox were the two companies that got chosen to have the half of a season coverage. And ESPN looked at me and they said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, look, I'm an ESPN guy. I'm here forever. I want to work here 30 years. And they said, we'd love to keep you, but where are we going to put you? And I went and did a couple hockey games, and I did a couple Sports Center hits and some other things. And it became evident pretty quickly that was not going to be for me to go down the road to chase some of those other sports. So I went to the bosses there and I said, hey, I don't know how we work these deals out because I have a brand new contract, but I'd like at least an opportunity to try to stay in motorsports. And they said, we want to do whatever we can, that's beneficial for everybody. And so I had to work the Fox guys over pretty hard. They weren't planning on using any of the talent that had been on ESPN. And I did a lot of politicking there. But once that opportunity came up, we were able to work the contracts out. And then in 2002, I started with Speed and Fox Network. And it was a great career from there till 2016.
What did that persistence look like for you when you were trying to get your name out there with Fox? Like, take me into the play-by-play of the efforts that you made to make sure that they knew who you were very interested, and you wanted to work with them.
It was pretty tough. I'll be honest with you. Rick Miner was a fellow in charge at the time, and he was a no nonsense and still is a very no nonsense kind of guy. And I went and had my first meeting with him, and he said, "Look, we're just not going to use any of the previous talent. I want a whole brand new slate. I want to change things up. We want to go way more fun and entertaining, and not so much serious." And not so much breaking news. And I said, well, anyway, it took 4 or 5 meetings together for sure. And I took a laptop in and I showed him some examples of some of the things that I did at the time as far as tech tips go and the technical side of the thing. And it took quite a bit of prodding, but eventually I think he saw that somehow I could mix in with his new idea of being more fun and entertaining. And eventually we got it worked out where I was able to be part of that team. And boy, over the years, we had so much fun in the truck series. A lot of fans aren't familiar with the truck series as much as they are, especially if they're just Cup fans. But boy, the drivers that we had at that time were so much fun. We had experienced drivers who were coming down on the backside of their Cup career, and we had young kids who were moving their way up, and then we had guys right in the middle, and it was a great selection, so many fun years. But quite honestly, I think at some point Rick Miner flipped a coin, and I'm lucky it came down on the head side.
Speaking of fun, I saw that you guys during broadcast would dress up like for Halloween.
Yeah, oh yeah.
You busted out a Batman mobile. How did you find that?
Boy, once we made the commitment to do those Halloween shows, because we always had a race normally at a Martinsville Speedway or Talladega right on Halloween weekend, and we said, man, we got to do this. It'll be super fun. And it took a lot of work. Actually, that Batmobile came from Atlanta, and we had to really work hard to convince that guy to come over there. But what was cool is we got him a trip through the Cup garage and a bunch of autographed hats and shirts and stuff. So he was pretty happy when he rolled out of there that day. But it took a couple of months of planning for each of those. We did 4 or 5 years where we really put a big effort into that. We did a Wizard of Oz scene that was really, really good, and loved the Batman one, of course. But yeah, it was it didn't just happen. I can tell you that there were 4 or 5 people involved in lots of planning to get really authentic costumes. And Keith D'Alessandro was our producer at that time, and boy, he spent a lot of effort in saying, let's make these legit. And they brought in good makeup people. We had great costumes. But yeah, the Batman one was super fun. You can't go without seeing Adam Alexander as Robin. I mean, he was the perfect fit.
I love how you guys went all out on that. Ray Dunlap is with us. I'm Bryan Fenley. So when you talk about being in the garage, whether it's the Truck Series or the Cup Series or whatnot, what do you see and have seen over the years that even the most diehard avid fan doesn't know what it looks like inside the garage? Like the most devoted diehard fans, when they think of a garage, what do they not know that you know when you're actually stepping in there and witnessing what's taking place?
I think there's 2 answers to that question, and the first is the difference in the drivers and their knowledge of the actual race cars. There are 1/3 of the drivers in that garage who could tear every nut and bolt off that car, and they go in and they can build shocks, and they're able to understand anything an engineer brings to them. The other 1/3 of those drivers are trying to learn, and they care, but they're not the kind of guy that's going to get on a scooter and go underneath the car and understand where all the hookup points are. And then the other 1/3 of the drivers, they don't care about any of that stuff. They just communicate on the radio and say, I'm tight in the middle, and this is what it's like. And I found that really over the years in almost every series that I covered in the garage is that the difference between those 3, there wasn't necessarily one of the 3 positions that made a driver better. It's really about how they balance that out with their crew chief and their crew. So I always found that really interesting, that some of the guys were so incredibly technical. Rusty Wallace, when we would go to Bristol, Rusty would build his own shocks with Jeffrey Thousand, and those guys would be in there looking at each of them, and he'd have 7 or 8 sets that they would try in one practice session, and other drivers would maybe go through 2 sets, and chances are they weren't totally sure the difference between number 1 and 2, and Rusty would go through 7 sets, and they would say, man, number 5's it, and then that was their plan for the weekend. It was really quite interesting. I think the other thing, to answer that question, my other side that's really intriguing is how the crew members change from one team to another, and how one individual person can go at the end of a season and move to another team and make a dramatic difference. And I think we miss that quite often in the big picture because we're so driver focused and we spend our time talking to the crew chiefs. But a lot of times one person comes over and it's either it's either just their personality or their knowledge or whatever it is that can really take a team from average to really good, or from good to great.
There are good and there are great drivers. And I'm curious to know, when it comes to broadcasting, obviously having access is crucial to your
Sure.
job as a storyteller. Why do you think that some drivers are more open to access and why some are more closed off? And why you think that there's an advantage to being closed off, and then maybe there's an advantage to being more open to it? How you see both sides of the aisle here as far as how drivers approach media?
Well, when I start to think about the answer to that, of course, the number one thing comes to my mind is the Jeff Gordon effect. I covered Jeff Gordon whenever he was in sprint cars. We used to do Thursday Night Thunder all around Indiana. And when I met this kid, I was like, boy, he's really, really something. But I had no idea how much he would change the big picture of how the drivers dealt with the media. And basically his willingness to play that part and his great answers. You know, you look at the Jimmy Johnson effect, you look at, the comedy of a Clint Boyer, and how those guys have built a career on getting sponsors because they're so likable. And back in the day, when I started and we had Earnhardt and Mark Martin and Bill Elliott, none of those guys wanted to talk to me. They wanted to focus on what they were doing. And it was a slow transition with a number of these guys. Number one, building time with them and trust, and getting them to know that, you're not going to throw them under the bus takes a while. But the Jeff Gordon effect has changed the whole world. Look at our drivers today, of, the William Byrons and, the younger kids all grew up watching Jeff Gordon do very good interviews with excellent answers, thought-provoking, not just saying, yeah, we were tight in the corner. So I think time changed a number of those guys, but a great example is Bill Elliott and I did not have a good relationship at all. Whenever we were working, back when he was driving, actually there was a number of times where he just told me to piss off. And I went back to him and to his PR people, and I said, you're making a big mistake because this will hurt you. And then later, whenever Chase was coming up and doing ARCA races and things like that, and I was in the garage, Bill and I struck up this friendship and spent a lot of time together and went to dinner some evenings and talked. And I'm like, wow, this guy's really interesting and he's funny. And I like being around him, but that's not the same guy that I used to work with that drove the 9 car. So I think sometimes it's time, but in the big picture, I think the Jeff Gordon effect has changed, the sports world in general. You look at, even in baseball, look at the access we have to baseball players today that they didn't have, in the 80s or 90s. And they're developing personalities, and people get to know them better. So that's the really positive side of the way things changed.
Yeah, the influx of endorsements, the personality leads to the brand, which makes you more marketable beyond what you do as a driver. We're joined by Ray Dunlap. I'm Bryan Fenley. And as far as access, as let's say a watcher, a viewer of productions, broadcasts of, let's just go with the Cup Series here, what do you think more can be done to heighten the excitement for fans so that they feel even closer to the action? I know there's been a lot that has been done to make fans feel like they're there, the cameras inside the cars and you hear the radio, but what more do you think could be done to be more appeasing to fans, to even lure them more in during broadcasts?
Boy, that's a really good question. I'd have to give that a little thought to see about where I would want to go in the future. The racing is the hardest sport to convey on television compared to live. I feel like when I watch a pro football game or a college football game, the experience isn't incredibly different from being there and watching the game. But watching a TV race, it's the noise level, it's the being able to see the whole track, it's the surroundings. I don't know. It's so hard to convey. And our television production crews today, they're the best. They're just amazing at doing the job, and we get such great shots. So visually, I'm not too sure. I've seen a few things they did this year on Fox that were pretty interesting with the, obviously uh, what's the helicopter that flies around?
Oh,
Drone. The
okay.
drone brings you
Drone.
some
Okay.
really
Yeah.
nice angles and some interesting things. But you also, you get in during live action, you get into a worry that any of that technology might somehow break down or cause a problem in the race. So I don't have a good answer for your question. I'm sorry. I'll have to give that a little more thought. But I feel like the television production now is very realistic, and I love the camera that's on the driver's helmet inside the car. Some people don't like that at all because it's jittery, but if you've ever been in a race car, you realize that it's very much very close to what it really feels like in there. But it's just impossible to convey the speed at the line or the G-force in the corner or the sound of a race over television. It just doesn't translate.
That's a great point. I got an interesting question for you. So
Yeah.
you work a lot with and have worked in the past with on track courses. So where and when is there a time in your life when it comes to your career when you've had to go metaphorically off-roading in your career, where things didn't go down the track the right way and you had to find a way, where maybe some adversity struck in your career or some adversity or an obstacle, and while the track is clean, and paved and everything like that, you had to find another way to go off-roading, if that makes sense.
Sure. Sure. Well, again, two quick answers. The first answer is I went from being just a sideline or play-by-play guy a little bit into the technical side. And because I had driven cars and worked on them and spent a lot of time in the race shops in Charlotte, a little bit of a side thing became my deal of being able to explain the technical side of it. And then, of course, we had Camping World came into the truck series, and they created a little Camping World Destination Recreation, and I had to go try to be creative of doing a sales spot and trying to make it seem not like a sales spot. And we did that for Hooters restaurants on Race Hub and a couple of different things. And for whatever reason, the bosses kept calling me because they said, "Hey, you can do this." But I appreciated those opportunities. But it was kind of the beginning of, hey, you're not a productive journalist, you're an entertainer. And I had a little bit of a struggle with that. I've always been a fun guy, I think, and fun to be around. And I try to have humor as much as possible in our broadcast, but I also wanted it to be serious. And doing some of those other things was a bit of a off the road, as you put it. Yeah. The second answer to that was, in my career, I had 2 times where I was suspended from broadcasts, and each of those were different situations. But the real difficulty of that was I didn't have an opportunity to give my side or explain what happened in each of those events. And it really worked out where it was like the bosses said, "Look, let this time pass, let's sweep it under the rug and let's move forward, and you're going to keep working and everybody will be happy, and you don't have to dwell on this." But those were both of those times were pretty hard because people on the outside don't know really what happened, and they look back and they go, "Hey, he's a bad guy." And that always hurt me personally a little bit. But we got through them and moved on, and everything was okay. But that was certainly off the track for sure. I was down in a mud hole and not sure I had enough tires to dig out.
How long would you let that bother you when you got back on the air and you're back at it? And how long would your mind drift back to that in the past?
Oh, I mean, it never goes away in a tiny little spot somewhere in the back, because you say, I wish I could have told the whole story, but sometimes that's not necessary. And again, it's time to move on. But as far as getting right back to work, the next week you go in the garage and, everybody's coming up to you and asking what you did on your week off, and I'm like, well, what do you think I did? I sat and I watched racing. So But no, I mean, a lot of people razzed me about it, and we had a lot of laughs. And I mean, it's just, it was part of the deal. Lots of crew chiefs get suspended from the race each weekend, and they have to go home, sit at home, and don't get to be in charge of their race car. So they take it pretty tough too. But no, as far as getting back into the swing of work the next week, I think I did a pretty good job of erasing that and going back to do the job. But as far as it stays with you for quite a while, especially when some people you meet, that's all they know about you.
I got a fun last question for you. Speaking
Okay.
of work and fun,
Yeah.
someone who you got to work with, Dr. Jerry Punch. What is
Amazing.
What is your career like based upon his mentoring to you and how he elevated your career?
Couldn't have done it without him, for sure. I'm very fortunate that he and I are still close friends, and we stay in contact, see each other a couple of times a year, go out to dinner and have a good time. But you got to remember back in the day, and you talked about the fear factor when you go in at the very beginning. You got to remember when I got started at ESPN and they put me on pit road for cup races, I've got Ned Jarrett, Benny Parsons, Bob Jenkins in the booth, and I've got Jerry Punch, John Kernan, and Bill Weber on pit road, and I'm trying to find a way to thread into that broadcast crew. And in my opinion, what we had in those golden years at ESPN with Neil Goldberg producing and Mike Wells at the helm, we had a crew that really had something special. And Jerry is such a giving person. And, even knowing inside his head that somewhere down the road, I might be the guy that would take his place and his job, he didn't care about that. He's like, look, I'm going to help you. He taught me so much about the process of being in the garage and how to approach people. He taught me his paperwork system, which I basically copied everything of the way he did, carrying notes and keeping track of things on a cardboard sleeve. But what he really taught me, I think the most, was about appreciating the moment that you're in, and especially like at that time with such a great group of people. People say all the time, well, boy, this new TV crew, they're awesome. And and maybe it's a little bit nostalgia, but I'll put up that ESPN crew from back in 2000 up against anybody. I really will. I think we had a connection that was really something. And Jerry being at the racetrack was such a benefit to everybody because he has a dry sense of humor that will absolutely come out of left field and whack you in the head. And so he broke the ice all the time in moments that sometimes were a little bit tense. Also, his medical knowledge was a great benefit in that garage because there was always somebody having some kind of an issue, and they would go to him not like a broadcast partner, but like a friend or a brother or an uncle, and talk to him. And I think that's the way pretty much anybody that ever worked with him felt, was that he's more of a friend than a co-worker. And like I said, I'm very fortunate that we've stayed close over the years.
To have him as a friend, I feel like how he presented himself on the air, it's been like you feel like he's your friend.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sort of dynamic shows itself again. And what a classy move, like you were talking about, Ray, when he knows that maybe you're going to be next in line for what he's doing, but for him to have the ability to say, I just want to do what's best for.
And I'll tell you, Bryan, I don't know that I had that inside me, but after having worked with him, it changed my approach. And over the years, when Caitlin Vincey and some of the other younger and newer talent came in, and the bosses said, hey, will you help them? I said, you betcha I will. I'll go right in there and help them in any way I can. And that probably wasn't the way I'd have been had I not known Jerry Punch. So, he definitely influenced me in that way, in a very positive way. And I'm very grateful for that, for sure.
The everlasting impact of Dr. Jerry Punch and your impact on the sport, Ray, invaluable and priceless. Ray Dunlap, I'm Bryan Fenley. Appreciate you talking about your career, the stories, and learning more about you and your drive and what makes you inspirational. Really appreciate your time.
Well, thanks. I had a great time. Sure enjoyed it.